deep in a remote forest, Drassa suddenly opens her eyes when the sound of an approaching plane cuts through the silence. Instantly alert, she reaches for her weapon and prepares herself. The moment a man steps out of the aircraft, a shot rings out, and he is killed with a clean bullet to the head. Elsewhere, former Marine Levi jolts awake from a disturbing nightmare. Unable to shake off the images in his mind, he heads to the beach, hoping the calm waves and empty shoreline will help him clear his thoughts. By morning, his peace is interrupted by a message ordering him to report to the Marine Corps base. Later, at the base, Levi is introduced to Agent Bartholomew. She already knows his record inside and out. Levi has served as an elite sniper, built an exceptional military career, and has no close family or friends tying him down. Because of that, she has come to offer him a special assignment. Meanwhile, in Lithuania, Drassa visits a cemetery with her father on the anniversary of her mother's death. The meeting quickly turns emotional when her father reveals that his cancer has progressed too far for treatment. Since he knows there is no real hope left, he tells Drassa that if he is still alive by February 14th, he plans to end his own life so he can be reunited with his wife on Valentine's Day. Months later, in September, Levi wakes up inside a plane, groggy from anesthesia. Confused, he asks a nearby soldier where they are, but she tells him she is not authorized to reveal that information. She collects all of his personal belongings and explains that the aircraft is approaching a restricted no-fly area. From this point on, he will have to jump and travel the remaining distance on foot. Levi takes the assigned pack, moves to the exit, and leaps from the plane. He waits carefully for the right altitude before opening his parachute. After landing safely, he begins a long and exhausting journey through the wilderness. The trip forces him to climb steep terrain, hike for miles, and camp in rough conditions as he pushes deeper into unknown territory. Eventually, Levi reaches the edge of an enormous gorge. There, he encounters a soldier named J.D., who has already spent an entire year stationed at the site. Strangely, even J.D. still has no idea where they actually are. He leads Levi to the West Tower, a fully self-sustaining outpost equipped with solar panels, a backup generator, a rainwater system, a vegetable garden, and enough nearby wildlife to hunt for food. Across the gorge stands the East Tower, but J.D. makes it clear that communication with the guards stationed there is strictly forbidden. The gorge itself is heavily secured. Landmines and tactical barriers cover the northern and southern approaches, and there is no usable path across the divide. As J.D. gives Levi the tour, he explains the daily responsibilities. Every day, Levi must patrol the western rim and refill the ammunition in the automatic gun turrets placed every 600 meters. He also has to inspect the containment fence, check the suspended mines, and maintain devices known as cloakers, which send out false signals to satellites so the gorge remains hidden from the world. The radio only activates once every 30 days for a check-in, and outside communication is impossible. In the event of a serious emergency, there is a panic button that triggers something called the Stray Dog Protocol. J.D. admits he has no idea what that protocol actually does, but he warns Levi that if it ever gets activated, the smartest thing to do is run. J.D. then explains that the operation dates all the way back to the Cold War. At that time, military forces from several nations secretly agreed to protect the location and keep it completely off the books. The secrecy is so extreme that even presidents and heads of state are unaware of its existence. Levi's mission is simple on paper. Nothing inside the gorge is allowed to escape. At first, it sounds unbelievable, and J.D. admits he once thought the same thing. But that changed after he saw the creatures the guards now call Hollow Men. Soon, their shrill screams echo up from the depths of the gorge, proving that whatever is down there is very real. J.D. goes on to say that in the late 1940s, 3 battalions on horseback were sent into the gorge to wipe out whatever lived inside. None of them ever came back. Since then, the military abandoned the idea of clearing the place out and focused entirely on containment. After briefing Levi, J.D. leaves the tower and begins the long hike toward the extraction point. Once he reaches the pickup area, a helicopter arrives and lowers a rope for him. A soldier asks him to confirm his identity. As soon as J.D. gives the correct password, the soldier shoots him in the head and lets his body fall into the mountains below. 1 month later, Levi has settled into the dull rhythm of the post. His days are spent walking the perimeter, servicing the security systems, and completing the scheduled radio check-ins. When the radio finally connects, the voice on the other end only asks whether everything is normal. Before Levi can ask any questions, the call is cut off. While tending the garden one day, Levi notices movement near the opposite tower. He rushes to his binoculars and spots Drossa chopping wood. She notices him watching, but instead of reacting, she simply ignores him and continues with her work. One stormy night, Levi is shaken awake by another nightmare. In his panic, he breaks a glass and immediately thinks he is under attack. He grabs his gun, ready to defend himself, but then feels a sharp pain in his foot. Looking down, he realizes he has stepped on the broken glass. Once he understands it was only an accident, he slowly calms himself. As he cleans the cut on his foot, Levi notices that Drossa is still awake in the east tower and watching him from across the gorge. When she realizes he has noticed her, she quietly turns away and goes to bed. Another month passes, and Drossa is left to celebrate her birthday completely alone. Bored and frustrated by the isolation, she fires her gun to get Levi's attention. Then she holds up a sign asking for his name. Levi responds with a sign of his own, reminding her that they are not allowed to communicate. Drossa ignores the rule completely. She writes back with her own name and adds that since it is her birthday, she is going to do whatever she wants. Amused by her attitude, Levi finally plays along. He writes his name for her and raises a glass so they can share a toast from opposite sides of the gorge. Drossa then turns up music and starts dancing in her tower. As she moves with the rhythm, she gestures for Levi to join in. He writes back that he's a terrible dancer, but an excellent sniper. Drossa answers by firing a shot that knocks the water bottle near him. Levi reacts instantly, grabbing his rifle and shooting her bottle in return. Enjoying the challenge, Drossa places another bottle on top of her head, clearly daring him to keep the game going. But before things can continue, she suddenly freezes. Something is moving down inside the gorge. When Levi looks down into the darkness, he sees something horrifying crawling up the rock face on his side of the gorge. The figures look almost human, but their bodies seem twisted together from bark, branches, and roots, like people who have somehow become part of the forest itself. Levi wastes no time. He raises his rifle and fires at one of the creatures, sending it tumbling down the wall. The monster lands directly on a mine, triggering a violent explosion that rips through the gorge and knocks most of the other climbers loose with it. But the attack is not over. A few of the creatures are still clawing their way upward, so Levi keeps firing. Across the divide, Drossa immediately joins the fight, using her machine gun to help cover his side. Together, they cut down the remaining monsters in only a few minutes. Just when it seems like the danger has passed, one of the creatures manages to reach Drossa's balcony. She spins around and fires several shots into it before finishing the job by kicking it over the edge. Then, the situation gets worse. More monsters begin scaling the wall on Drossa's side of the gorge, forcing both soldiers to coordinate again from opposite towers. They unload on the creatures, trying to stop them before they can reach the top. Another Hollow Man drops onto a mine, causing a second explosion. This time, a piece of flying metal tears through the air and strikes Drossa in the shoulder, injuring her. Still, she does not stop fighting. Soon, the creatures are climbing both sides of the gorge at once. Levi and Drossa race between their weapons, firing the machine guns and triggering more mines as a backup defense. This time, their combined assault is enough. One by one, the monsters are destroyed until the walls finally go still and no more creatures appear. By morning, Drossa treats the wound in her shoulder. Despite everything that happened, she tells Levi that it was the best birthday she has ever had. Afterward, Levi heads down to repair the damage caused by the attack and replace the mines that were used during the fight. While he is working, something unexpected happens. A drone suddenly rises out of the gorge and flies away into the distance. In December, Levi tries to bring a little warmth into the cold isolation. He decorates a tree in the forest with strings of lights, turning it into a makeshift Christmas tree. He also puts up a sign for Drossa so she can see it from her tower. From that point on, the two of them begin finding ways to spend time together, despite the distance between them. They build snowmen and label them with each other's names. They play chess from opposite sides of the gorge. They even turn pots into drums and make music together, turning their lonely posts into something that almost feels normal. Then February 14th arrives. Levi notices Drossa crying while looking at a family photograph. Concerned, he asks why she skipped her patrol earlier. Drossa admits that the day has been difficult for her, and she quietly says she wishes he could be there with her. Determined to reach her, Levi goes into the armory and uses whatever tools and parts he can find to build a strange device. After some work, he fires a rocket across the gorge. The rocket makes it to the other side and gets caught in a tree, though it also accidentally starts a small fire. Drasa rushes out to put out the flames. When she reaches the tree, she realizes the rocket has a rope attached to it. Understanding what Levi is trying to do, she secures the rope tightly around the tree and runs back to the tower. There, she sees Levi holding up a sign asking her to dinner. Levi then slides onto the rope and begins crossing the gorge. For a moment, the plan seems to work, but halfway across, he gets stuck. Fortunately, he is wearing gloves, so he grips the rope with his hands and slowly pulls himself the rest of the way. At last, he reaches Drasa's tower and presents her with flowers. Drasa immediately points out that he smells terrible after all the effort it took to get across. Levi accepts the criticism and agrees to take a shower. While he washes, Drasa takes his uniform and lays out cleaner, nicer clothes that once belonged to a previous guard stationed there. Later, during dinner, they talk honestly about their lives as mercenaries. They discuss the things they have done, the missions they have survived, and the way this kind of work damages the mind over time. The conversation brings them closer. After dinner, they dance together, and the night eventually turns intimate. The next morning, Levi prepares to return to his own tower. He starts sliding back across the rope, but suddenly, the Hollow Men appear on his side of the gorge. One of them sets off a mine, causing a massive explosion that severs the rope. Levi drops into the gorge. Reacting quickly, he opens his parachute as he falls. Across the gorge, Drasa runs straight to her armory, grabs as many weapons as she can carry, and puts on a parachute of her own. Without hesitating, she jumps after him. After falling for several miles, Drasa crashes into a river far below. When she surfaces, her parachute gets caught on a rock, forcing her to cut herself free. The current immediately drags her away, slamming her body against another rock and causing her to accidentally lose the auto-ascender. The river keeps pulling her downstream, but Drasa manages to grab onto exposed tree roots and drag herself onto land. Meanwhile, Levi is unconscious, dangling from a tree by his parachute lines. Suddenly, one of the branches begins to move, revealing that it is not a branch at all, but another monster. As the creature crawls closer, Levi wakes up. He immediately opens fire while trying to free himself from the tangled ropes. He finally drops to the ground, landing in what looks like thick mud. But then, the sticky surface begins to shift. It is not mud, it is the mouth of another creature. The adhesive substance wraps around Levi, trapping him as the monstrous mouth slowly begins closing around him. Just before it can swallow him, Drasa hears the gunfire and arrives. She opens fire on the creature, forcing it back and saving Levi at the last possible second. Once the danger passes, Drasa uses a knife to scrape the sticky substance off Levi's body. After that, the two begin moving toward the gorge wall, hoping to find the rope and make their way back up. Before they can get far, a piercing screech cuts through the forest. Two hollow men appear, riding horses that look just as twisted and tree-like as they are. The riders charge at Levi and Drasa with swords. One of them leaps from its horse and attacks Drasa directly. She drives a knife into its neck, forcing it to fall, then shoots it in the face to finish it off. The second rider uses a whip to rip Levi's weapon from his hands. Levi quickly draws another gun and fires, killing both the horse and the rider within seconds. After the fight, Drasa checks her bag and realizes the auto-ascender was lost in the river. With the gorge walls far too tall to climb by hand, they have no way back up. Drasa suggests they follow the river, reasoning that it must eventually lead somewhere. Levi then examines one of the dead creatures more closely and notices something chilling. It is wearing an extremely old military uniform. That means the Hollow Men are not just monsters, they are the missing horseback battalions from JD's story. With no other option, Levi and Drasa continue deeper through the forest. As they move, they pass hundreds of skeletons scattered across the ground, silent proof that countless others have died in the gorge before them. Eventually, Levi and Drasa come across the remains of an abandoned town. Every structure has been swallowed by mutated plant growth, with vines and strange vegetation crawling over the walls like the buildings are being slowly digested by the gorge itself. The ground is cracked and broken too, showing clear signs of damage from an old earthquake. Before they can investigate for long, the familiar screeching of the monsters echoes through the area. More creatures are coming. With nowhere safe in the open, Levi and Drasa hurry into a nearby church and hide inside. The moment they enter, they see rows of skeletons sitting in the pews. Levi catches a sharp smell in the air and recognizes it as cyanide. That tells him the people here did not die fighting. They chose to end their own lives because surviving in this place had become unbearable. Then, a sudden sound comes from above. Drasa looks up just in time to see a massive spider-like creature drop toward her. It lunges at her, but she reacts quickly, shoving it away before falling hard to the floor. As she lands, she spots another spider rushing toward her. Drasa drives her knife into it, while two more spiders attack Levi. Levi raises his weapon and shoots them before they can overwhelm him. But the fight is only beginning. More spiders begin crawling out from the shadows, surrounding them from every direction. Levi and Drasa open fire, taking down as many as they can while trying to keep the swarm from closing in. Drasa runs out of ammunition in the middle of the chaos. Levi immediately moves to cover her, firing at the creatures while she reloads. Once she is ready, they start pushing toward the door, hoping to escape before the spiders overrun them. But just as they reach the exit, several hollow men burst into the church. Now Levi and Drasa are trapped between two threats. They have to split their focus, shooting the spiders while also fighting off the hollow men. Drasa grabs one of the creatures and smashes its head repeatedly against a table before throwing it aside. The spiders instantly crawl over the fallen monster as if it is just another piece of prey. Levi is forced into close combat as more creatures rush him. After a rough struggle, he manages to get enough space to shoot them down. Seeing no clean way out, Drasa fires a grenade into the back wall of the church. The explosion blasts open a huge hole, giving them a chance to escape. The two sprint into the forest, but the screams of the creatures still carry through the trees behind them. Out in the open, they are far too vulnerable, so they decide to move closer to the gorge wall in search of better cover. Soon, they discover an old door built into the rock. They get inside and find a facility that has also been overtaken by mutated plants. The deeper they go, the clearer it becomes that this place was once a military laboratory. Skeletons are scattered throughout the halls, and an old generator sits nearby. Drasa manages to get it running, bringing parts of the facility back to life. Levi finds an old film reel, so they load it into a projector and watch. In the footage, a scientist explains that the year is 1946. The community inside the gorge was created as part of a secret coalition between multiple nations. During the final years of World War II, the scientists stationed there were working on biochemical missiles. But 6 days before the recording was made, an earthquake struck the region and caused a chemical leak. The scientists tried desperately to contain the toxin, working non-stop to keep it from spreading. Instead, the chemical began combining with the DNA of the local plants and animals, mutating everything it touched. The scientist explains that brief exposure to the toxin does not cause immediate harm. A few hours inside the contaminated area might not change a person at all, but the longer the scientists worked, the more poison they absorbed. Eventually, it began altering them as well. The proof is right there on the screen. The woman in the recording reveals branch-like growths spreading across her stomach. The only reason the disaster never reached the rest of humanity is because the base was sealed inside the gorge. The cliffs that trapped them also kept the toxin contained. In another room, Levi and Drasa find a computer from the late 2000s. That means the original disaster did not end the operation. People kept returning to this place long after the first experiment went wrong. Levi powers up the machine and discovers that the facility belongs to Dark Lake, a private paramilitary corporation. The drone they saw earlier was not random. It had been collecting biological samples from the gorge for Dark Lake's research. The company has been trying to use the mutations to create super soldiers. The towers, the secrecy, and the guards hired to watch the gorge are all part of the same cover-up. The soldiers are not just protecting the world from the gorge, they are protecting Dark Lake's secrets. As Levi searches through the files, he also finds the real meaning of the Stray Dog Protocol. It is not a rescue plan. It is a nuclear bomb designed to sterilize the entire area if the contamination ever breaks containment. As they prepare to leave the facility, Levi tells Drasa that despite everything they have been through, taking this mission was worth it because it led him to her. They open the door and toss out a smoke grenade before stepping outside. But the moment they move through the smoke, the hollow man's whip snaps out and wraps around Drasa's ankle. Before she can react, she is dragged away. The rider pulls her violently through the forest as she struggles to free herself. Drasa tries cutting the whip with her knife, but she slams into a tree and drops the blade. She tries to shoot at the rider, but the rough terrain makes it nearly impossible to aim while rocks and fallen logs keep battering her body. Levi follows the trail left behind by the rider, tracking the marks through the forest until he eventually reaches the facility containing the nuclear bomb. Inside, the Hollow Man has suspended Drasa from above. He twists the branch lodged in her stomach, using it to torture her before finally ripping it out. Drasa refuses to break. She kicks him hard in the chest, then manages to untangle the ropes from the beam and free herself. Once she drops down, she shoves the Hollow Man back and grabs a piece of metal to use as a weapon. The fight is brutal. The Hollow Man keeps overpowering her, and the snake-like creature living inside his chest tries to strike at her too. But Drasa keeps fighting. She manages to cut off the snake's head, then hurls the piece of metal at the Hollow Man. It barely hurts him, but it does make him furious. He charges after her around the room, swinging his sword with savage force. Drasa uses old bones as a makeshift shield, and then grabs fire from a nearby bonfire, turning it into a torch. When the Hollow Man comes at her again, she burns him. As he screams in pain, Levi finally arrives. He raises his gun and fires until the Hollow Man is dead. After the fight, Levi and Drasa rush into each other's arms, relieved to still be alive. Once they pull apart, Levi checks the dead Hollow Man more carefully. On the creature's old uniform, he notices a name stitched into the fabric. Levi recognizes it immediately. This was the very first guard ever stationed in his tower. Levi takes the creature's sword, and the two continue searching for a way out. As they move deeper through the facility, they eventually reach the exact place where the original chemical leak happened. The sight is horrifying. Mutated creatures are everywhere, trapped inside the thick, living goo created by the toxin. Levi and Drasa begin crossing a bridge through the contaminated area. All around them, distorted faces are buried in the slime, still breathing inside the sticky mass. The entire place feels alive, as if the gorge itself is watching them. Then, Drasa accidentally steps on a root. When she tries to pull her foot free from the sticky substance, the bodies trapped in the goo suddenly start dropping toward her, trying to grab her and drag her in. Levi reacts fast, using the Hollow Man's sword to slice through the roots and free her before the mass can pull her under. But now, larger creatures are starting to wake up. Their roars echo through the chamber as they stir inside the mutated structure. Levi keeps cutting a path forward with the sword, but a whip-like strand of goo suddenly lashes out, wraps around his ankle, and yanks him to the ground. Drasa fires a grenade behind them, setting off a massive explosion. The blast ignites the creatures, and the flames begin spreading rapidly through the entire goo-covered structure. With fire consuming everything behind them, Levi and Drasa race toward the stairs and finally manage to escape. Once outside, they search through the abandoned town and eventually find a garage with old military jeeps still inside. They work on one of the engines, doing enough repairs to get it running. Then they climb in and drive for hours through the gorge until they reach the broken rope. Levi quickly ties the rope to the jeep, preparing to use it to climb back up the gorge wall. Meanwhile, Drasa holds off the hollow men that begin closing in on them. She fires until her ammunition runs out, then she and Levi switch places without wasting a second. With the jeep ready, they begin driving upward along the wall, using the rope to pull themselves toward the top. At first, the plan works surprisingly well. But soon they realize the hollow men are climbing after them. One creature reaches the jeep, and they kick it off. Levi uses the stolen sword to slash down the others as they crawl closer. Drasa finds an axe in the toolbox and starts fighting them off too. While Levi shoves one monster into the wheels, Drasa smashes another that lands on the front windshield, knocking it away before it can break through. Then, one of the hollow men leaps onto Levi and shoves him off the side. Levi manages to grab onto the jeep at the last second, leaving him dangling over the drop. While hanging there, he stabs the jeep's gas tank before climbing back up. Once he is inside again, Levi lights a flare and throws it toward the creatures. When the flame reaches the leaking propane, it triggers a huge explosion. The blast burns through the hollow men chasing them, but it also destroys the jeep. Levi is thrown into the wall and breaks his leg from the impact. Drasa rushes to help him, pulling him up before more creatures can reach them. Since they are now much closer to the top, they decide to cut the rope and let the ruined jeep fall. It crashes down onto the remaining hollow men below. After that, Levi and Drasa climb the rest of the way up and finally make it back to Drasa's tower. As they tend to their injuries, they agree to stay separated for 5 days as a quarantine period in case either of them has been infected. But they also know they cannot remain at the gorge anymore. They decide to escape together, and to make sure Darklake can never use the place again, they begin planning to destroy it. Before Levi leaves, he and Drasa share a kiss. Levi tells her that he loves her, Then he uses a grappling gun to launch himself back across the gorge to his own tower. The next day, the scheduled radio check-in begins. This time, Levi does not hear the usual operator. Agent Bartholomew answers instead. She knows that the computer inside the lab was recently turned on, and she questions Levi about it. Levi denies ever entering the gorge. Bartholomew then concludes that the guard in the other tower must have gone down there, so she gives Levi a new mission: kill the person stationed across from him. Levi pretends to accept the order until the call ends, but Bartholomew already knows the truth. The lab computer had a camera, and she has seen footage proving that both Levi and Drasa were inside the facility. She contacts a commander and orders him to prepare a team to enter the gorge. The following morning, while Levi and Drasa are setting up mines for their plan, Drasa holds up a message for Levi. It says that she loves him too. Before they can enjoy the moment, they spot a helicopter approaching. Levi and Drasa immediately run into the forest. When Bartholomew's soldiers reach the towers and find them empty, they deploy drones to search the area. A chase begins. The drones quickly locate Levi and Drasa and open fire. The two soldiers shoot back while running through the forest, taking down the drones one after another. Both of them suffer injuries during the fight, but they keep moving. Once they reach higher ground, Levi and Drasa take up sniper positions. From there, they aim at the cloaking devices hiding the gorge from satellites. They begin shooting the cloakers, and the mines they planted earlier trigger a chain reaction that destroys more of the devices across the area. With the cloaking system collapsing, the gorge is finally exposed. That activates the stray dog protocol. Bartholomew and her team rush back to the helicopter, desperate to escape before the bomb detonates. Levi and Drasa run as fast as their wounded bodies allow. Then, the nuclear device goes off. The explosion tears through the gorge with unbelievable force. The blast wave knocks Bartholomew's helicopter out of the air, sending it crashing down and killing everyone on board. But Levi is caught in the force of the explosion as well. He is thrown from the cliff edge and disappears into a river below. Drasa survives and manages to hide inside a cave, where she waits for Levi to return. A month passes with no sign of him. With no news and no way of knowing whether he is alive, Drasa finally leaves the area on her own. Some time later, in France, Drasa is working quietly as a waitress. One day, while serving tables, she is stunned to see Levi sitting there in front of her. He explains that it took him a while to recover from his injuries, but he eventually found his way back. Overcome with emotion, Drasa goes to him, and the two reunite with a kiss. One of the things that immediately grabbed me about The Gorgeous is how confidently it throws out its central idea without really caring whether it sounds ridiculous on paper. Because if you stop and think about it for a second, the setup is kind of wild. Somewhere in a remote, hidden location, there's this massive gorge that apparently contains something so dangerous that it's been under constant surveillance for decades. Not by armies, not by entire military bases. Just one highly trained operative on each side, living alone in isolated watchtowers, keeping an eye on whatever might be lurking below. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of premise that can either fall apart instantly or become strangely compelling. For me, it worked. Not because it makes perfect sense. It doesn't. The movie asks for a pretty generous suspension of disbelief right from the start. But there's something undeniably intriguing about the image itself. Two towers, one gorge, two strangers stationed across from each other, and a giant question mark sitting in the middle. The film understands that mystery is doing a lot of the heavy lifting early on, and to its credit, it doesn't rush to explain everything. Instead, it lets you sit with the situation for a while. You watch these characters settle into routines. You notice the strange rules they're expected to follow. You start wondering who built this place, why it's still operating, and what exactly everyone seems so afraid of. That's where the movie is at its strongest in the opening stretch. There's a feeling that you're uncovering fragments of something much larger. Every detail feels like it might matter later. Every warning sounds slightly more ominous than it should. Even simple things, radio check-ins, perimeter inspections, old stories passed down from previous guards, carry this sense that there's a much bigger secret hiding underneath the surface. And what I appreciated is that the movie doesn't initially play like a horror film or even an action movie. For a while, it almost feels like a strange science fiction mystery. The kind of story that starts with a simple question and slowly expands outward. The gorge itself becomes the hook. You don't know what's down there. You don't know who's really in control of the operation. You don't even know if the people running it can be trusted. The uncertainty is what keeps you watching. At the same time, there's something refreshingly old school about the concept. It feels like the sort of idea that could have come from a classic sci-fi short story. A bizarre premise, a secluded location, a handful of characters, and a mystery that's bigger than any one person involved. That's probably why the movie stands out compared to a lot of modern streaming releases. Most big-budget genre films tend to explain themselves immediately. They want you caught up within the first 15 minutes. The Gorge is more interested in letting the premise breathe. It wants you to absorb the atmosphere first and start asking questions later. And whether you ultimately buy into everything the movie does afterward, I think it's hard to deny that the setup is effective. Because before the monsters, before the action, before the explanations and revelations, there's just that image sitting in your mind. Two isolated snipers staring across an impossible gorge, guarding a secret neither of them fully understands. That's a pretty good hook. What makes that opening premise work isn't just the mystery of what's inside the gorge. It's the amount of thought the movie puts into the world surrounding it. Now, I don't mean this is some incredibly detailed science fiction universe with pages of lore and endless explanations. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. The film gives you just enough information to make the place feel real without dumping a history lesson on your head every 10 minutes. As Levi settles into his assignment, you start picking up pieces of how this whole operation functions. There are protocols, checkpoints, weapons systems, layers of security that suggest people have been dealing with this problem for a very long time. And honestly, that's where my curiosity started growing. Because nobody seems surprised by any of this. The existence of the Gorge isn't treated like a shocking discovery. To the people running the operation, it's just another responsibility. Another secret that's been quietly managed for decades. That detail alone raises a lot of questions. Who built all of this? How long has it been here? How many people actually know the truth? The movie never rushes to answer those questions, which I appreciated. It lets them hang in the background while the story keeps moving. One thing I found interesting is how the Gorge almost starts feeling like a geopolitical relic. The setup suggests this strange cooperation between opposing world powers, with both sides maintaining watch over the same threat. Even before you know the full story, there's something fascinating about that idea. It's like everyone involved hates each other, but they're forced to agree on one thing. Whatever is down there absolutely cannot be allowed out. That alone creates a weird tension. The operation feels massive, but at the same time strangely fragile. You have these enormous defenses, automated weapons, surveillance systems, layers of secrecy. Yet somehow the actual responsibility ends up resting on two isolated people living alone in towers. The more I thought about it, the more it started feeling like one of those old science fiction concepts where the premise is intentionally a little absurd because it's trying to explore something bigger underneath. And to the movie's credit, it understands that mystery can sometimes be more powerful than explanation. There are details that get filled in later, but there are also plenty of things left vague. Some viewers are probably going to find that frustrating. I can understand that reaction because there were definitely moments where I wanted more information. Not because I was confused, because I was interested. There's a difference. I wanted to know more about the people who created this operation. I wanted to know how many similar secrets exist in this world. I wanted to spend more time understanding the history behind what happened here. That's usually a good sign. When a movie leaves you wanting more because the world feels larger than the story being told, that's often evidence that the concept itself is working. At the same time, I think the film is smart enough not to get completely lost in its own mythology. It keeps the focus on the immediate situation. The Gorge exists. It's dangerous. The people in charge are hiding things, and the two people stationed there are slowly realizing they know far less than they thought. That balance between mystery and information is probably one of the reasons the first half works as well as it does. You're constantly learning something new, but never enough to feel comfortable. And that uncertainty becomes part of the appeal. The deeper the movie digs into the history of the Gorge, the more you start realizing that the real story isn't just about what's trapped down there. It's about the people who built the cage in the first place. And that's really where the Gorge started winning me over. Not because I was completely invested in every character right away. Not because I was blown away by the action. Honestly, at that point, I was mostly just curious. I wanted answers. The movie does a pretty good job of understanding that curiosity is its strongest weapon early on. It keeps dangling little pieces of information in front of you without ever handing over the full picture. You'll get a strange warning from a previous guard, then a random detail that doesn't seem important at first. Then another question gets added before the last one is answered. It's constantly stacking mysteries on top of each other. Normally that can get annoying. We've all seen movies that mistake confusion for intrigue. They keep withholding information simply because they think secrecy automatically creates suspense. It doesn't. What makes The Gorge work, at least for a while, is that every new piece of information feels like it's connected to something bigger. You don't get the sense that the writers are making things up as they go along. Instead, it feels like there's an actual answer sitting behind the curtain somewhere, and the movie is slowly guiding you toward it. That's important, because the audience can usually tell the difference. There were multiple points during the first half where I found myself mentally trying to solve the puzzle. Every new rule, every strange detail about the operation, every odd piece of history surrounding the gorge felt like it might become relevant later, and more often than not, it does. Not always in groundbreaking ways, but enough that the setup feels purposeful. The film is surprisingly patient about all of this too. A lot of modern blockbusters seem terrified that viewers might get bored if they aren't being bombarded with action every few minutes. The Gorge takes a different approach. It lets uncertainty carry entire stretches of the movie. Sometimes the most interesting thing happening isn't a fight or an explosion. It's a conversation, or a warning, or a tiny clue that suddenly changes how you interpret everything you've seen so far. That's where the mystery element is strongest. You start questioning who's actually in control of this operation. You start wondering why so much secrecy is necessary. And maybe most importantly, you start asking whether the people stationed here are being told the truth at all. The movie keeps pushing those questions forward. Of course, eventually it has to start providing answers. That's always the risky part. Building mystery is often easier than resolving it. Almost any story can create questions. The hard part is delivering explanations that feel satisfying once the audience finally gets there, and I think that's where reactions to The Gorge are probably going to split. Some viewers are going to enjoy the reveals because they fit the movie's pulpy science fiction DNA. They explain enough to keep the story moving while opening the door for bigger action and bigger spectacle. Other viewers might feel the opposite. The more the film explains, the less mysterious it becomes. Once the unknown becomes known, some of that eerie tension naturally disappears. I actually found myself somewhere in the middle. I liked learning more about what was happening. I liked seeing the movie connect certain clues and ideas that had been planted earlier. There was definitely satisfaction in watching pieces of the puzzle come together. But I also think the film is at its most fascinating when you're still wondering. When you're staring into the fog with the characters, when every sound from below feels significant, when you don't know if the threat is supernatural, scientific, military, or something else entirely. There's a version of the movie where that uncertainty lasts even longer, and I honestly think that version might have been even stronger. Still, I never felt completely disconnected from the mystery. Even after major revelations start arriving, the film keeps finding new questions to raise. Maybe not questions as compelling as the original one, but enough to keep the story moving forward. And that's probably the best compliment I can give this aspect of the film. For most of its runtime, I genuinely wanted to know what was coming next. Not because the movie was hiding information from me, because it convinced me that the answers were worth finding. For all the mystery surrounding the gorge, the movie eventually realizes something important. You can only stare into a giant hole in the ground for so long before the audience starts looking for actual people to care about. That's where Levi and Drasa come in. What's interesting is that neither character is introduced as some larger-than-life action hero. Yes, they're both elite snipers. Yes, they're exceptionally skilled at what they do. But the movie spends surprisingly little time trying to convince us how dangerous or badass they are. Instead, it leans into something much simpler. These are two people who seem completely disconnected from the rest of the world. Levi especially feels like someone drifting through life before the mission even begins. He's highly capable, but there's this emptiness hanging over him. You get the sense that he's accepted isolation long before he ever arrived at the tower. The assignment almost feels less like a job and more like a continuation of the life he was already living. Drasa has her own version of that loneliness. She's more expressive than Levi, more willing to break routines and push against the rules, But underneath that confidence, there's a similar sense of distance. The film gives her personal concerns outside the mission, and while those moments aren't explored in extraordinary depth, they do help make her feel like a person rather than simply the woman on the other side of the gorge. And honestly, that separation is what makes these characters work. Not because they're incredibly complex, not because the script dives deeply into every corner of their psychology, but because the situation naturally strips everything else away. There are no crowded supporting casts here, no endless subplots competing for attention, no side missions stealing focus. For long stretches of the movie, it's basically just these two people existing inside their own thoughts. That's a risky choice. When a film reduces its world down to two central figures, there's nowhere to hide. Every quiet scene matters. Every interaction matters. If the audience doesn't connect with those characters, the entire structure starts wobbling. I found myself appreciating how differently the two are written. Levi often feels withdrawn, almost resigned to his circumstances. He's someone who follows instructions because that's what he's always done. Even when strange things start happening, his first instinct is usually to observe before acting. Drasa is the opposite energy. She's curious, restless, sometimes impulsive. If Levi represents discipline, Drasa represents disruption. The moment she starts questioning the rules, the entire dynamic of the story begins to shift. And that's probably why their scenes work on a basic storytelling level even before you get into any discussion about romance. They're approaching the same situation from completely different emotional directions. One accepts isolation. The other refuses to. One keeps his distance. The other immediately starts looking across the gorge. That contrast creates movement within the story. What I also liked is that both characters are carrying baggage without the movie constantly stopping to announce it. There are hints of regret, trauma, loss, and personal disappointment woven into who they are. The film doesn't always explore those ideas as deeply as it could have, but they're there. You feel them. Sometimes in the way Levi reacts to things, sometimes in moments where Draza's confidence briefly cracks. Those little details help give them some weight beyond their function in the plot. Now, I don't think either character is revolutionary. Nobody is going to put Levi or Drasa alongside the greatest science fiction protagonists ever written. The script occasionally leans on familiar archetypes, and there are moments where you can see exactly what role each character is supposed to play within the larger story. But I also think the film understands that these characters don't need to be endlessly complicated. They just need to feel human enough for us to care what happens to them. And for me, they mostly do. By the time the larger mysteries start opening up and the movie begins leaning harder into its action and horror elements, Levi and Drasa have already become the anchor holding everything together. The gorge might be the reason the story starts, but these two characters are the reason it keeps moving. Now, this is probably where opinions on the gorge are going to start dividing a little more, because liking Levi and Drasa as characters is one thing, thinking they're particularly deep characters is another. And honestly, I'm kind of torn on it. On one hand, the movie does a good job giving both of them enough personality to stand out. You can tell them apart immediately. They have different ways of dealing with isolation, different attitudes toward authority, different emotional walls they've built around themselves. That's all important, especially in a story where these two are carrying such a huge percentage of the screen time. But at the same time, I never felt like the screenplay was digging especially deep beneath the surface. A lot of what we learn about them comes in broad strokes. Levi is the damaged soldier trying to find purpose. Drasa is the highly skilled operative hiding vulnerability behind confidence. Those character types work. There's a reason movies keep returning to them. The problem is that the Gorge occasionally seems satisfied just establishing those traits instead of really exploring them. There were several moments where I found myself wanting one more layer, not necessarily more backstory. That's different. I don't need a 20-minute flashback explaining every decision these people have ever made. In fact, movies often make that mistake. They think more information automatically equals more depth. What I wanted was a stronger sense of who these characters are when nobody's watching. What keeps them awake at night? What do they regret? What do they actually want outside of surviving this mission? The film touches on some of those ideas. You can see hints of them throughout the story. The problem is that the movie is usually more interested in moving forward than sitting with those questions for very long. And I get it. This is still a genre movie. Eventually, monsters need to show up. Mysteries need answers. Action sequences need to happen. The script has a lot of plates spinning at once. Because of that, some of the character work ends up feeling more functional than truly revealing. That's especially true once the story starts expanding beyond the towers. The first half actually gives the characters room to breathe. They're isolated. They're bored. They're forced to occupy space together. Those quieter moments naturally create opportunities for personality to emerge. Later on, the focus shifts. The plot starts demanding attention. The mystery becomes larger. The stakes increase, and character exploration sometimes takes a back seat. That said, I don't think the writing fails these characters. Far from it. The screenplay understands something that a lot of big-budget genre films forget. Characters don't always need lengthy speeches explaining their emotions. Sometimes small details do more work. A glance across the gorge. A hesitation before answering. A moment where somebody breaks routine. A joke that lands because it reveals something about how a person thinks. The Gorge has quite a few moments like that. They're easy to overlook because they're not presented as major emotional revelations, but they quietly help build the personalities underneath the action. I also appreciated that the movie doesn't try to turn either lead into a flawless superhero. They're extremely capable, sure, maybe a little too capable at times, but they're also lonely people making questionable decisions, sometimes emotional decisions, sometimes reckless decisions. And honestly, that makes them more believable than if the movie had treated them like perfect military machines. If I had one major criticism, it's that the script occasionally relies on the audience filling in emotional gaps on its own. Some viewers will probably enjoy that. Others might feel like the movie is doing just enough character work to keep the story functioning without fully earning some of its bigger emotional moments later on. I can understand both perspectives. Personally, I landed somewhere in the middle. I liked these characters. I cared about them. I wanted them to succeed. But I also came away feeling like there was an even stronger version of the Gorge hidden somewhere inside this screenplay. A version that spent just a little more time digging beneath the archetypes and discovering what made Levi and Draza truly unique. Because the foundation is there, you can see it. The movie just doesn't always push quite as far as it could. The thing about the Gorge contracts that surprised me the most wasn't the monsters, it wasn't the mystery. Honestly, it wasn't even the giant secret buried underneath the entire premise. It was the fact that this movie is way more interested in being a love story than I expected. Going in, I thought the relationship would probably be a subplot, something that exists alongside the action and horror, a little emotional thread running through the bigger story. That's not really what happens. The relationship is the story for huge portions of the film. Everything else almost feels built around it, and I can already see why that's going to be a deal breaker for some viewers. Because if you watch the trailer and expect a non-stop sci-fi horror thriller, the movie spends a surprisingly long time doing something much quieter. It's about two isolated people slowly becoming part of each other's lives. What's funny is that the romance starts in a way that probably shouldn't work as well as it does. These two are separated by an enormous gorge. They're not supposed to communicate. They know almost nothing about each other. And yet, because they're completely cut off from the rest of humanity, even the smallest interaction starts carrying weight. A wave means something. A handwritten sign means something. A simple acknowledgement from the other side of the gorge suddenly becomes the most interesting part of their day. The movie actually understands loneliness pretty well. Not in some devastatingly profound way, but in a recognizable way. Human beings aren't built for isolation. Eventually, people start looking for connection wherever they can find it. That's what makes the relationship feel believable to me, at least in concept. It's less about instant attraction and more about two people clinging to the only meaningful human interaction available to them. The distance between them becomes part of the appeal. Every conversation requires effort. Every moment together feels earned because the movie spends time showing how difficult even basic communication is under these circumstances. And honestly, some of my favorite scenes in the entire film happen before anything major goes wrong, before the action escalates, before the mystery starts revealing itself. Just watching these two figure out ways to connect across an impossible distance is strangely charming. The film finds little moments of playfulness there. Moments where the story relaxes and lets the characters simply enjoy each other's company. Those scenes give the movie a personality that a lot of modern sci-fi thrillers don't really have. Now, does every aspect of the romance work perfectly? Not necessarily. There were times where I felt the movie was asking me to accept emotional leaps a little faster than I naturally would have. Certain developments arrive right when the plot needs them to arrive. You can feel the screenplay nudging things along from time to time. I don't think it's a fatal problem, but it's noticeable, especially because the relationship becomes so important to everything that follows. The movie is essentially making a bargain with the audience. It's saying, if you invest in these two people, the rest of the story will matter more. And whether that bargain works is probably going to determine how much you enjoy the film as a whole. Because once the story shifts into bigger action sequences and larger revelations, the emotional stakes are no longer about the mystery. They're about Levi and Drasa. That's the center of gravity. Not the monsters, not the conspiracy, not the Gorge itself. Them. I actually respect that choice, even if I don't think the movie fully maximizes it. There are plenty of genre films where characters fall in love because the script says they should. Here, at least, the relationship feels connected to the circumstances. Their loneliness matters. Their isolation matters. The environment itself pushes them toward each other. The romance isn't happening next to the story. It's growing out of the story. And I think that's an important distinction. Whether you're completely invested in the relationship or not, the movie deserves some credit for committing to it. A lot of films flirt with emotional ideas before retreating back to explosions and spectacle. The Gorge does the opposite. It keeps returning to the connection between these two people, even when bigger and louder things are happening around them. For better or worse, the heart of this movie isn't buried somewhere inside the Gorge. It's sitting in those towers, looking across at the person on the other side. Now, here's where things get interesting, because when I started reading reactions to The Gorge, I noticed something that almost never happens to this extent. People completely disagree about the chemistry between Miles Teller and Anya Taylor-Joy, and I don't mean slight disagreement. I mean some people walked away convinced the movie works largely because of their connection, while others came away wondering if they were watching the same film. That's a pretty huge gap. Usually when audiences talk about chemistry, there's at least some kind of consensus. Maybe it's great. Maybe it's mediocre. Maybe it's non-existent. But with The Gorge, reactions seem all over the map. After watching the film, I can honestly understand both sides. For me, their chemistry wasn't really about sparks flying off the screen every time they looked at each other. It wasn't that kind of performance. What I noticed more was how comfortable they became sharing space within the story, or, in this case, sharing distance. That's actually a harder thing to pull off than it sounds. For a significant portion of the movie, these characters aren't standing face to face having long conversations. They're communicating through binoculars, handwritten messages, gestures, routines, and brief moments of connection separated by hundreds of feet of empty space. That's a strange challenge for actors. Most romantic films rely heavily on physical proximity. The performances build through eye contact, body language, conversations, arguments, flirtation. The Gorge spends a lot of time denying its actors those tools. They have to create connection without actually being together, and I think Teller and Taylor-Joy handle that challenge reasonably well. There are moments where the relationship feels genuine simply because both actors understand the loneliness driving it. You get the sense that these aren't two people falling for each other because destiny says so. They're falling toward each other because they're isolated, bored, curious, and desperately looking for something meaningful in an otherwise empty existence. That part felt authentic to me. At the same time, I can also understand why some viewers weren't completely convinced. There are scenes where the relationship moves very quickly, scenes where the screenplay seems more interested in arriving at emotional milestones than fully earning them. When that happens, even strong actors can only do so much. Sometimes chemistry isn't just about performance, it's about writing, it's about pacing, it's about whether the audience believes enough emotional groundwork has been laid before the next step in the relationship arrives. And I think that's where some of the criticism comes from, not necessarily because Teller and Taylor-Joy lack chemistry, but because certain viewers may not fully buy how quickly the relationship develops. For me, though, the film benefits enormously from casting two actors who are naturally likable. That's something people often underestimate. You don't always need explosive chemistry. Sometimes simple screen presence goes a long way. Teller has this relaxed, understated quality that keeps Levi from becoming overly brooding. He could have easily turned into a stereotypical damaged soldier character, but there's enough warmth underneath the surface to keep him approachable. Taylor-Joy brings a completely different energy. She's more playful, more unpredictable, more willing to disrupt the routine that Levi has settled into. When those energies bounce off each other, the movie becomes more enjoyable to watch, even in scenes where very little is actually happening, and honestly, that's probably the biggest compliment I can give their dynamic. There are stretches of The Gorge where the entire movie is essentially asking you to watch two people communicate across a giant canyon that shouldn't be as entertaining as it is. Yet somehow it works often enough that you stay invested. Not because every romantic moment is perfect, not because every line of dialogue lands, but because both actors seem genuinely committed to the idea that these characters need each other. You believe they want to keep talking. You believe they're looking forward to the next interaction. You believe the connection matters to them. And once you buy that, even partially, a lot of the movie's later emotional beats become easier to accept. Now, whether you see their chemistry as the film's greatest strength or one of its weaker elements will probably come down to personal taste more than anything else. I've seen convincing arguments from both sides. What I will say is this: if the relationship completely fails for you, a huge portion of The Gorge is probably going to collapse with it. The movie is taking a gamble. It's betting that you'll care about these two people. Everything else, the mystery, the action, the creatures, the secrets hiding beneath the gorge, is ultimately built on top of that foundation. For me, the foundation wasn't flawless, but it was strong enough to hold the rest of the movie together. The more I thought about The Gorge after watching it, the harder it became to describe what kind of movie it actually is. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I genuinely think that's part of its identity. If somebody asked me, "So what is it?" I'd probably hesitate for a second, because calling it a sci-fi movie feels incomplete. Calling it a horror movie isn't quite right either. It's definitely not just an action film, and it's far more romantic than most people are probably expecting. The movie keeps shifting between all of those things, sometimes within the same sequence. One minute you're watching two lonely people find ways to communicate across an impossible distance. The next minute you're dealing with military secrets, strange creatures, and questions about what exactly is being hidden inside this massive gorge. Then, before you've fully settled into either version of the film, it pivots again. That's a dangerous balancing act. A lot of genre mashups fail because they never figure out which side of their personality should take priority. You end up with movies that feel like four different ideas fighting for screen time. There were moments where I worried The Gorge was heading in that direction, especially during the first hour. Not because it was bad, but because I kept trying to figure out what kind of story it wanted to become. Was this ultimately a mystery? A monster movie? A survival thriller? A romance? The answer seems to be yes, all of them. What's surprising is how often that actually works. The romance gives the mystery emotional stakes. The mystery gives the romance a reason to exist. The horror creates tension. The action provides release. Each genre ends up feeding the others rather than completely overpowering them, at least most of the time. I think one reason the film manages to stay afloat is because it never treats any of its elements as a joke. A lesser version of this movie might have leaned into irony. It could have started winking at the audience every time the premise became ridiculous. Thankfully, it doesn't. The movie takes itself seriously, not in a self-important way, more in a committed way. It fully believes in its strange world, and that confidence helps sell some ideas that probably shouldn't work on paper. Because, let's be honest, the basic concept is kind of absurd. A love story between two snipers guarding a mysterious gorge filled with horrors, while an international conspiracy unfolds around them, sounds like somebody combined three completely different movie pitches into one script. And yet somehow, it exists. What's interesting is that different viewers are probably going to latch on to completely different parts of the experience. Some people are going to remember the romance. Others will remember the monsters. Some will be there for the mystery. Others just want the action scenes. The movie almost feels designed to appeal to several different audiences at once. That creates both advantages and problems. The advantage is that there's usually something happening to keep your attention. The downside is that if one of those elements doesn't work for you, you'll feel it. If the romance doesn't land, you're losing a huge part of the movie. If the mystery disappoints you, that's another major piece weakened. If you're expecting non-stop horror, you're probably going to spend long stretches waiting for a movie that never arrives. That's why reactions to The Gorge have been so mixed. People aren't necessarily watching the same movie. They're connecting with different parts of it. For me, the most successful aspect of the genre blending is that the film never becomes predictable emotionally. Predictable plot-wise? Maybe occasionally, but emotionally, not really. The story is constantly changing shape. Just when it starts feeling like a quiet relationship drama, it becomes something else. Just when it feels like a military conspiracy thriller, it shifts again. Then suddenly, you're in territory that feels closer to creature feature science fiction. That unpredictability kept me engaged even during sections that weren't entirely working. I was always curious about what version of the movie I was going to get next. Now, does every genre transition feel seamless? Not always. There are definitely moments where you can feel the gears turning underneath the story. Moments where one aspect of the film gives way to another a little abruptly. But honestly, I'd rather watch a movie that's willing to take those risks than one that plays everything completely safe. Because whatever flaws the Gorge may have, it never feels trapped inside a single formula. It's messy at times, it's strange, it occasionally feels like several movies sharing the same runtime. Yet somehow that's also part of what makes it memorable. The film spends its entire runtime walking a tightrope between romance, horror, science fiction, action, and mystery. And even when it stumbles, there's something undeniably entertaining about watching it try. One thing I wasn't expecting from the Gorge was how long it takes before it really shows its hand on the horror side. The movie spends so much time building mystery, developing the relationship, and letting the audience settle into this strange routine that when the horror elements finally start becoming more visible, they almost feel like they're arriving from a completely different movie. I mean that in a good way. For a while, the creatures are more of an idea than a presence. You hear about them, you see signs of them, you get warnings about them, but the film understands that uncertainty can be creepier than immediate answers. The imagination does a lot of work during those early sections. Every time somebody mentions what's living below, your brain starts building its own version of the threat. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the atmosphere works so well in the beginning. The Gorge itself feels hostile long before anything actually crawls out of it. There's this constant feeling that something is wrong. Not necessarily supernatural, not necessarily scientific, just wrong. The fog covering the Gorge helps with that. The distance helps. The fact that nobody wants to explain everything helps. It creates this sense that the characters are standing on the edge of something they don't fully understand. Then eventually, the movie has to show you what's down there. And that's always a risky moment for horror. The second you reveal the monster, you're making a trade. Mystery goes away, and now the design has to carry the weight. Sometimes that works beautifully, sometimes it doesn't. I think the Gorge lands somewhere in the middle, depending on what you're looking for. What I appreciated is that the creatures don't feel completely generic. There are a lot of modern monster movies where the designs blur together after a while. You forget them almost immediately. Here, the filmmakers at least try to give the creatures their own identity. They're unsettling in a way that's hard to pin down at first. Human enough to be disturbing, different enough to feel unnatural. That combination creates some genuinely creepy imagery, especially during the moments when the film leans into body horror influences and starts showing the consequences of whatever has happened inside the Gorge. Those sequences were probably the closest the movie came to making me uncomfortable. Not terrified, not hiding behind a pillow, but uncomfortable in a way that good creature design sometimes achieves. You look at something and immediately think, yeah, that's not right. And that's enough. What surprised me is that the movie isn't really interested in becoming a full-blown horror experience. Even once the monsters appear, the Gorge never transforms into a relentless nightmare. It doesn't suddenly become one of those films where every corner hides another scare. The creatures are important, but they're only one ingredient. The movie remains focused on adventure, mystery, and action just as much as horror. Some viewers are probably going to wish it went darker. I actually found myself thinking that a few times. There are moments where the film brushes up against genuinely unsettling ideas, and I was curious what would have happened if it had pushed a little further into that territory. The atmosphere often feels scarier than the actual attacks. The concept feels scarier than some of the execution. That's not necessarily a flaw, but it's something I noticed. At the same time, I don't think the monsters are supposed to be the sole attraction here. They're part of a larger package. The creatures give physical form to the mystery that's been hanging over the story since the beginning. They provide answers while also creating new problems for the characters. In that sense, they work. Whether every visual effect holds up perfectly is another conversation. Some shots are stronger than others. There were definitely moments where I could feel the digital effects working a little harder than they should. But from a design perspective, I thought the movie did enough to make the creatures memorable. And honestly, memorable counts for a lot these days. There are plenty of big-budget monster movies where I couldn't describe a single creature a week later. I don't think that's the case here. More importantly, the horror isn't just coming from the monsters themselves, it's coming from the idea behind them. The thought that something has been hidden for decades. The thought that generations of people have been guarding this secret. The realization that the threat isn't just what lives in the gorge, but what created it in the first place. For me, that's where the horror becomes most interesting. Not when something jumps out of the darkness, but when the movie starts revealing why the darkness exists at all. And in those moments, the Gorge feels less like a creature feature and more like a strange science fiction nightmare that's been quietly waiting beneath the surface the entire time. What's funny about the Gorge is that for a movie built around elite snipers, hidden monsters, automated defenses, and a giant classified death pit, it's actually pretty patient before it fully embraces its action side. The first half spends so much time building atmosphere and relationships that you can almost forget there's a creature feature lurking underneath all of it. Then, eventually, the movie decides it's done waiting. And when it does, it goes pretty big. What I liked is that the action doesn't arrive completely out of nowhere. The film spends so much time establishing the towers, the weapons, the security systems, and the routines of daily life that when things finally start going wrong, it feels like a payoff rather than an interruption. You've spent all this time hearing about potential threats. Eventually, the movie has to cash that check. For the most part, I think it does. One thing Scott Derrickson understands is scale. Even when the action becomes chaotic, you never completely lose track of where people are or what they're trying to accomplish. That's something a surprising number of modern action movies struggle with. They'll throw explosions, creatures, vehicles, and visual effects at the screen until everything becomes noise. The Gorge gets messy at times, but it rarely becomes confusing. There's always a clear objective. Survive, escape, reach the other side, hold the line. Whatever the immediate goal happens to be, the movie generally keeps it simple enough that the action remains easy to follow. And honestly, that's underrated. Some of my favorite sequences weren't necessarily the biggest ones either. They were the moments where the environment itself became part of the action. The Gorge is such a strange location that almost every confrontation feels slightly different from a standard action movie. Characters aren't just fighting enemies. They're navigating cliffs, towers, bog, ruined structures, and terrain that constantly feels unstable. That helps give the action its own identity. You don't watch these scenes and think, I've seen this exact setup 100 times before. Even when certain action beats are familiar, the setting adds something fresh. There's one sequence in particular involving a vehicle that feels exactly like the kind of idea somebody would pitch during a late-night brainstorming session and somehow convince everyone else to film. And you know what? It works. Not because it's realistic, not because it makes perfect sense, because it's fun. That's actually something I found myself appreciating more and more as the movie went on. The Gorge isn't trying to be a military procedural. It's not obsessed with tactical realism. When the action arrives, the movie becomes surprisingly comfortable leaning into spectacle. It wants excitement. It wants momentum. Sometimes it wants pure chaos. And as long as you're willing to meet it halfway, there's enjoyment to be found in that approach. Now, I don't think every action sequence lands equally well. A few moments feel a little too dependent on visual effects. A few confrontations are more memorable in concept than execution. There were occasional stretches where I felt the movie was more interested in escalating the scale than building tension. That's a difficult balance. Action gets louder very easily. Suspense is harder. The strongest sequences are usually the ones where those two things are working together. When the characters are fighting their way through danger, but there's still uncertainty underneath everything. Those moments carry weight. The movie also benefits from the fact that the action is connected to characters we've already spent time with. That sounds obvious, but it's important. By the time the larger battles start happening, the film has already invested heavily in Levi and Drasa. The action isn't just there to wake up the audience, it's tied directly to people we've been following for a significant portion of the runtime. That makes a difference. When they're in danger, the scenes feel more engaging because the movie has actually done some groundwork beforehand. I also appreciated that the action evolves throughout the story. It doesn't stay trapped in one mode. It starts with defense, then survival, then exploration, then escape, The objectives keep changing, which helps prevent the second half from feeling repetitive. And while I wouldn't necessarily call The Gorge one of the great action films of recent years, I do think it understands something valuable. Action should feel like a release of pressure. The mystery builds pressure. The isolation builds pressure. The horror builds pressure. Then the action arrives and lets everything explode. Literally sometimes. By the end, the movie has transformed quite a bit from where it started. The quiet, mysterious atmosphere of the opening eventually gives way to something much larger and much more chaotic. Not everyone is going to love that shift. Some viewers will probably miss the slower, stranger energy of the first half. Honestly, part of me does too. But there's no denying that when the Gorge finally unleashes itself, it commits completely. And even when the movie occasionally gets carried away with its own ambition, I'd rather watch that than something that never swings at all. One thing I think almost everyone can agree on, whether they loved the Gorge or were disappointed by it, is that the movie knows how to create a striking image. There were multiple times while watching it where I found myself thinking, okay, that's a cool shot. Not because it was flashy. Not because it was trying to become the next wallpaper on somebody's desktop. Just because the filmmakers clearly understood how much of this movie's appeal depends on atmosphere. And honestly, atmosphere is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The Gorge itself is probably the film's greatest visual asset. Before we know what's inside it, before we understand its history, before the story starts explaining anything, it already feels unsettling simply because of how it's presented. It's enormous, it's isolated, it's usually covered in fog, mist, or shadow, and most importantly, it always feels deeper than it should. There's something about seeing those towers positioned on opposite sides of this massive void that immediately creates tension, even when nothing is happening. The location itself is interesting to look at. You understand why the movie keeps returning to wide shots of it. The setting is doing storytelling work. The towers deserve some credit too. I liked that they don't feel particularly glamorous. These aren't futuristic sci-fi headquarters packed with glowing screens and impossible technology. They're functional, slightly worn, built for a purpose rather than comfort. That detail helps sell the isolation. You can almost imagine what it would feel like spending months there. Waking up, checking the perimeter, looking out the window, seeing the same view every day. The production design quietly reinforces the loneliness that sits at the center of the story. What stood out to me most, though, was how often the movie uses space. A lot of modern blockbusters fill every frame with something. Movement, effects, characters, information. The Gorge occasionally does the opposite. It lets emptiness exist. You feel the distance between Levi and Drossa long before the relationship becomes important, because the movie constantly reminds you how far apart they are. Entire scenes are built around that separation. The gap between them becomes part of the visual language. That's not something every film would think to emphasize. There are also moments where the cinematography leans heavily into mystery rather than clarity. Sometimes you'll see shapes moving through fog. Sometimes the environment feels more threatening than the creatures themselves. Sometimes the movie deliberately hides details instead of showcasing them. I generally liked that approach. Not knowing exactly what you're looking at can be more effective than getting a perfectly lit close-up. Now, I will say there were moments where the darkness became a little excessive. Not constantly, but enough that I noticed it. There were scenes where I found myself squinting slightly, trying to figure out what was happening in the background. That's become a fairly common issue in modern streaming productions, and the Gorge occasionally flirts with that problem. Thankfully, it never becomes overwhelming. Most of the time, the visuals remain clear enough that the atmosphere enhances the story rather than obscuring it. What I appreciated most is that the movie never loses its sense of scale. Whether the story is focused on a quiet exchange between the leads or something much larger, the environment always feels massive around them. The characters often look tiny compared to the landscape. And that's important because the story itself is built around the idea that these people are confronting something much bigger than themselves. The visuals reinforce that constantly. Even after the movie shifts into heavier action territory, it continues finding interesting ways to frame the world. The Gorge remains the star attraction visually. Every return to it reminds you why the premise was intriguing in the first place. There are certain movies where you forget the setting, the moment the credits roll. I don't think that's the case here. The Gorge itself becomes a character, not in the cliché sense where people say every location is a character. I mean, it genuinely shapes how the movie feels. It influences the mood. It influences the pacing. It influences how the relationships develop. Take the Gorge away, and suddenly half the movie's identity disappears with it. That's probably the biggest compliment I can give the cinematography and production design. They don't just make the film look good, they make the concept believable. Even when the plot gets a little wild, even when the movie starts asking for some serious suspension of disbelief, the visuals keep pulling you back into the world. You may not buy every explanation, you may not buy every twist, but you buy the place. And for a movie built around one location more than anything else, that's a pretty significant achievement. Now, let's talk about the part of the Gorge that I think generated some of the most divided reactions, the visual effects. Because depending on who you ask, the CGI is either one of the movie's strengths or one of its biggest weaknesses. And honestly, I get both arguments. There were definitely moments where I looked at the screen and thought, okay, that looks pretty impressive. Then there were other moments where I became very aware that I was watching a digital creation. It's a mixed bag, not a disastrous one, not even a bad one, just inconsistent. What helps the movie is that the scope of what it's trying to accomplish is actually pretty ambitious. This isn't a film that's using effects for the occasional explosion or background enhancement. The entire concept depends on visual effects working. The creatures, the gorge itself, the environments, the large-scale action sequences, a lot of the world building. None of this exists without heavy digital involvement. So from the beginning, the movie is operating with a difficult assignment. And for the most part, I think it does a respectable job. The creatures are probably the clearest example. There were shots where I thought they looked genuinely unsettling. The movement felt unnatural in the right way. Certain designs had enough detail that they stood out from the endless parade of generic movie monsters we get these days. Then there were moments where the illusion slipped a little. Not enough to completely ruin a scene, but enough that I noticed the technology behind it. The thing is, I found myself caring less about perfect realism and more about whether the effects were helping create atmosphere. That's where the movie succeeds more often than not. Even when a specific creature shot isn't flawless, the overall environment usually remains convincing. The fog, the scale, the strange geography of the gorge, the ruined structures, the sense that you're entering a place where normal rules don't apply, it all works together. The individual effect isn't always carrying the scene by itself, the entire visual package is. And honestly, that's often how good effects should function. You shouldn't be staring at a single CGI element and grading it like an exam. Ideally, everything blends together into a larger experience. Most of the time, the Gorge gets close to that. One thing I appreciated is that the filmmakers didn't use the budget solely for spectacle. It's obvious money was spent here. You can see it. The production never feels cheap. The locations feel substantial. The action sequences have scale. The environments feel larger than what we normally associate with direct-to-streaming releases. There were multiple points where I found myself thinking this easily could have been a theatrical release a few years ago. That's not something I say about every streaming movie. A lot of streaming productions have this strange quality where they technically look expensive, but somehow still feel small. Everything is polished, but nothing feels tangible. The Gorge avoids that problem more often than not. The world feels lived in. The towers feel real. The operation feels real. Even when the story starts drifting into increasingly bizarre territory, the production design does a lot of work keeping everything grounded. Now, I will admit there were moments where I wished the movie leaned a little more heavily into practical effect. Maybe that's just the horror fan in me talking. There's something about physical creature work that still creates a level of texture and presence CGI struggles to replicate. When you know an actor is sharing the frame with something that physically exists, the scene often gains a different kind of weight. A few sequences in the Gorge left me wondering what they might have looked like with more practical elements mixed into the design. That said, I also understand why the filmmakers made the choices they did. Some of these creatures and environments simply wouldn't be possible without digital effects. The movie's entire visual identity depends on creating things that don't exist in reality. At a certain point, CGI isn't a creative shortcut, it's a necessity. And to be fair, the film usually uses it responsibly. The effects are there to support the story, not overwhelm it. That's an important distinction because a lot of modern blockbusters fall into the trap of treating visual effects as the main attraction. Bigger becomes better. More becomes better. Every scene turns into a competition to see how much digital imagery can fit into a frame. The Gorge doesn't completely avoid that temptation, but it exercises more restraint than I expected. The effects serve the concept. The concept doesn't exist purely to show off the effects. For me, that's why the production value ultimately leaves a positive impression. Even when some shots work better than others, there's a clear sense of effort behind the film. You can see where the budget went. You can see the ambition. You can see a creative team trying to build a world that's much larger than the handful of characters standing inside it. And honestly, that's part of what makes the movie enjoyable. It feels like a film reaching for something. Maybe it doesn't nail every visual effect. Maybe some creature shots will age faster than others. But I'd much rather watch a movie that takes a big swing with its imagination than one that plays everything safe inside a green screen hallway. The Gorge may stumble occasionally in its execution, but it never feels small. And for a story built around a giant, impossible chasm hiding the world's worst secrets, that sense of scale matters a lot. One aspect of the Gorge that I don't think it's talked about enough is how much of its atmosphere comes from what you hear rather than what you see. Because for a movie built around mystery, isolation, and things lurking in places they shouldn't be, silence becomes almost as important as the soundtrack itself. There are long stretches where the film isn't trying to overwhelm you with music, it lets the environment breathe. You hear wind moving through the landscape. You hear distant machinery. You hear the emptiness surrounding these towers. And that emptiness matters. The movie keeps returning to this idea that Levi and Drasa are living at the edge of the world. They're disconnected from everything familiar. No cities, no crowds, no constant noise. Just routine, isolation, and this enormous gorge sitting between them. The sound design reinforces that feeling constantly. Even before anything dangerous appears, there's a subtle tension built into the environment. The world never feels completely comfortable. It never feels entirely safe. There's always this sense that something could interrupt the quiet at any moment, and when those interruptions happen, they hit harder, because the movie has spent time establishing what normal sounds like. That's something a lot of films overlook. Noise doesn't create tension by itself. Contrast does. A loud moment feels louder when it emerges from silence. A creature sounds more threatening when you've spent several minutes hearing almost nothing at all. A gunshot lands differently when the world around it has been calm. The Gorge understands that pretty well. Then there's the score itself. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross have a style that's instantly recognizable at this point. Even if you don't know their names, you've probably heard their work before. What they've always been good at is creating music that feels less like traditional film scoring and more like an extension of a movie's mood. That's very much the case here. The music rarely feels like it's telling you how to feel. It isn't constantly shouting, "This is exciting," or "This is emotional," or "This is scary." Instead, it sort of seeps into scenes. Sometimes it's barely noticeable at first. Then you realize it's been quietly shaping the mood underneath everything. I actually think that approach suits this movie perfectly. The Gorge isn't really operating on straightforward horror logic. It's not built around jump scares every few minutes. A lot of the tension comes from uncertainty, curiosity, and the feeling that something isn't quite right. The score complements that. Rather than drawing attention to itself, it often creates a sense of unease sitting underneath the surface of a scene. You may not consciously notice it. You just feel it. What I found interesting is how the music adapts as the movie changes genres. Early on, the score helps support the mystery. Later, it leans more into the suspense. Then, when the action ramps up, the music shifts again without feeling like it belongs to a completely different film. That's harder than it sounds. Because this movie is constantly moving between romance, science fiction, horror, and action. A less flexible score could have made those transitions feel awkward. Instead, the music acts like connective tissue holding those different tones together. Even when the story itself occasionally feels like it's changing direction, the soundtrack keeps everything feeling part of the same world. I also appreciated that the movie isn't afraid to let emotional scenes breathe. There are moments between Levi and Drasa where the score doesn't try to force sentimentality. It doesn't become overly dramatic or manipulative. The music usually stays restrained enough that the performances remain the focus. That restraint goes a long way, especially in a film where the relationship is carrying so much of the emotional weight. And honestly, some of my favorite audio moments weren't even tied to the score. They were tied to atmosphere. The sounds coming from the gorge, the distant echoes, the strange noises that make you wonder what's happening somewhere out of frame. Those details add texture to the world. They make the location feel alive. Or maybe alive isn't the right word. Because sometimes the gorge feels like it's listening. That's a weird thing to say, but it's the impression I got. The sound design creates this sense that the environment itself is constantly present, even when nothing visible is happening. By the end of the film, I wasn't walking away humming a specific musical theme or thinking about a particular track. What stayed with me was the mood, the feeling, that constant mixture of loneliness, tension, curiosity, and danger that hangs over almost every scene. And honestly, that's probably the highest compliment I can give the music and sound design. They don't just accompany the story. They quietly become part of the atmosphere that's making the story work in the first place. At the end of the day, the Gorge asks a lot from its actors, probably more than people realize at first. It's easy to look at the giant mystery, the creatures, the action sequences, and all the visual spectacle and assume those are the things carrying the movie. But the more I thought about it afterward, the more I came back to the same conclusion. If the performances don't work, this movie completely falls apart. There's just no way around it. For a huge portion of the runtime, we're essentially watching two people isolated from the rest of the world. The cast isn't packed with major supporting players constantly jumping in to keep things moving. There aren't 10 different storylines competing for attention. Most of the weight lands directly on Miles Teller and Anya Taylor-Joy. And honestly, I think both actors understand exactly what kind of movie they're in. That's important because the Gorge walks a very strange line. It's sincere, very sincere. A lesser cast might have started treating parts of the script like a joke. They might have leaned into irony whenever the premise became particularly ridiculous. They might have tried to distance themselves from some of the stranger material. Teller and Taylor-Joy don't do that. They commit. Whether they're exchanging messages across the gorge, dealing with increasingly bizarre situations, or navigating some of the film's larger emotional moments, both actors play everything straight. That commitment helps more than I think people give it credit for. Starting with Miles Teller, I actually liked how restrained his performance is. Levi could have easily become one of those characters who's constantly reminding the audience how damaged he is. You know the type. The guy who spends every scene staring into the distance while talking about his trauma in vague, dramatic sentences. Thankfully, that's not what happens here. Teller plays him as someone who's emotionally closed off, but not completely broken. There's a difference. A lot of his performance feels internal. He spends much of the movie reacting rather than dominating scenes, which makes sense for a character who spent years isolating himself from other people. I also appreciated that he never tries too hard to make Levi seem cool. He's obviously capable. The movie establishes that immediately. But Teller keeps him grounded enough that he still feels like a person rather than an action movie archetype. Then there's Anya Taylor-Joy. And honestly, she brings a lot of energy to the film. Not loud energy, not over-the-top energy, just presence. The moment Draza starts disrupting Levi's routine, the movie becomes more engaging. Taylor-Joy has a way of making even simple interactions feel slightly unpredictable. You never get the sense that she's operating entirely inside the same emotional box as everyone else around her. That works really well for this character. Draza is the person who starts asking questions. She's the one willing to bend rules. She's the spark that gets things moving. Taylor-Joy understands that role perfectly. What I liked most is that she avoids turning Draza into a one-note tough girl character. The movie could have gone that route pretty easily. Elite sniper, highly trained operative, emotionally guarded. We've seen that character before. Instead, she allows moments of vulnerability to slip through without making them feel forced. There are scenes where you can see the loneliness underneath the confidence, and those moments help make the character feel more human. Now, whether you fully buy the romance is a separate discussion. We've already talked about that. But from a performance standpoint, I thought both actors did about as much as they could with the material they were given. In fact, there were several moments where I felt they were elevating scenes that probably wouldn't have worked nearly as well on the page. That's usually a sign you're dealing with strong performers. The supporting cast has a much smaller job, but they handle it well. Sigourney Weaver in particular has one of those roles where her presence does a lot of the work before she even says anything. The movie doesn't need to spend much time convincing you that her character has authority. Weaver walks into the frame and you immediately understand where she sits within the hierarchy of this world. It's a relatively limited role, but she gives it the right amount of cold professionalism. She feels like someone who knows far more than she's willing to reveal. The rest of the supporting players mostly exist to serve the larger story rather than steal focus, and that's fine. This was never meant to be an ensemble piece. Everything circles back to Levi and Drasa. Everything. The mystery works because they're investigating it. The romance works or doesn't work depending on them. The action matters because they're the ones experiencing it. The emotional stakes rise and fall based on how invested you become in their journey. That's a lot of responsibility for two actors. Fortunately, I think both Teller and Taylor-Joy are more than capable of carrying that burden. Are these career-best performances? Probably not. Are they performances that quietly hold together a movie that could have easily drifted into nonsense? Absolutely. And honestly, that might be just as valuable. Because when a film asks you to believe in secret military operations, impossible creatures, giant conspiracies, and a gorge hiding humanity's darkest secrets, sometimes the most important thing an actor can do is make the people at the center of all that chaos feel real. For the most part, Teller and Taylor-Joy manage exactly that. The more I think about the Gorge-ish, the more I come back to Scott Derrickson, because this is one of those movies that probably shouldn't work as often as it does. Seriously. If you strip the story down to its basic ingredients, it sounds like a collection of ideas that belong to completely different films. You've got a lonely romance, a military conspiracy, science fiction mystery, creature horror, action spectacle, a giant secret buried beneath the earth. And somehow all of that is supposed to fit into a single movie without collapsing under its own weight. That's not an easy assignment for any director. And while I don't think Derrickson pulls it off perfectly, I do think he's a huge reason the movie remains watchable even when certain elements start wobbling. One thing I've always appreciated about his work is that he tends to approach strange material with complete sincerity. He doesn't stand outside the movie and laugh at it. He doesn't constantly remind the audience how ridiculous everything is. He commits. That's important here because The Gorge asks viewers to accept a lot. The second a director starts acting embarrassed by a premise like this, the audience will pick up on it immediately. The illusion breaks. The whole thing starts feeling silly. Derrickson never lets that happen. From the opening scenes onward, he treats the gorge, the mystery, the creatures, and the relationship with equal seriousness. That confidence goes a long way. I think it's especially noticeable in the first half. Those early sections could have easily felt slow or uneventful. There's a lot of setup, a lot of waiting, a lot of scenes that rely more on atmosphere than plot progression. Yet the film rarely feels directionless. You can feel Derrickson carefully building the mood. He's letting the audience spend time in these locations, letting the silence settle in, letting the mystery breathe before the story starts providing answers. In an era where so many big-budget movies seem terrified of slowing down for even 30 seconds, I actually found that refreshing. Now, does every decision work? Not necessarily. There were definitely moments where I felt the movie was struggling to balance all of its different personalities. Sometimes it wants to be a romance. Then it wants to be a horror movie. Then it starts behaving like an action blockbuster. Then it circles back to mystery again. Those shifts can occasionally feel abrupt. But honestly, I don't know if that's entirely a directing problem. Part of that comes from the screenplay itself. The movie is juggling a lot of moving pieces, and no director could completely eliminate that challenge. What Derrickson does well is make those shifts feel intentional. Even when the film changes gears, it rarely feels accidental. You understand what kind of experience he's trying to create. Whether it always works for you is a separate question. What impressed me most was his handling of tone. That's probably the hardest thing in this movie. Not the creatures, not the action, not the visual effects. Tone. Because a movie like The Gorge can become ridiculous very quickly if the balance is off by even a small amount. Too much seriousness and it becomes self-important. Too much humor and the tension disappears. Too much horror and the romance gets buried. Too much romance and the mystery loses its edge. The film spends almost its entire runtime walking that tightrope. Sometimes it stumbles, but it never completely falls off. I also think Derrickson deserves credit for understanding scale. He knows when to go big, he knows when to pull back. Some of my favorite moments in the movie aren't the giant action scenes or creature attacks. They're the quieter moments where he simply lets two characters exist in a space together. There's confidence in that. A director who trusts atmosphere doesn't always need constant movement. A director who trusts actors doesn't always need constant dialogue. You see that throughout the film. At the same time, when the movie finally decides to embrace its more outrageous ideas, Derrickson doesn't hesitate, he goes for it. And honestly, I respect that. Even viewers who end up disliking parts of The Gorge will probably admit the film isn't lacking ambition. You can feel a filmmaker trying to make something a little stranger than the average streaming release. A little more personal, a little more willing to blend genres that normally stay separated. That ambition doesn't always translate into perfection. There are moments where I wish the horror had been pushed further. Moments where I want a deeper character exploration. Moments where the mystery could have remained mysterious a little longer. But those are usually criticisms of execution, not intent. The intent is clear. Derrickson wanted to make a movie that felt different. Not radically experimental. Not completely unconventional. Just different enough that you couldn't neatly place it into a single box. And honestly, that's probably why the movie sticks in my head more than some objectively cleaner films. It's messy, it's uneven in places, it's occasionally overambitious. But it has a personality. You can feel a director making choices rather than simply assembling content. In today's streaming landscape, that alone makes The Gorge stand out more than you might expect. One thing I found myself appreciating about The Gorge is that underneath all the creatures, conspiracies, sniper towers, and action sequences, there's actually a handful of ideas the movie keeps returning to. Now, I don't want to oversell this. This isn't one of those films that's constantly stopping to deliver grand philosophical statements about humanity. It's not trying to become a lecture. Most of its themes are woven into the story rather than announced out loud, but they're definitely there. The most obvious one is isolation. And honestly, the movie almost couldn't avoid that theme even if it tried. The entire setup is built around it. Two people stationed in the middle of nowhere. No real human contact, no normal life, no meaningful relationships, just routine after routine after routine. What I found interesting is that the film doesn't treat isolation as something heroic. Sometimes movies romanticize loneliness. They present characters who stand apart from everyone else as somehow stronger or more enlightened because of it. The Gorge doesn't really do that. If anything, it presents isolation as a kind of slow erosion. You can function, you can survive, you can convince yourself you're fine. But eventually, the lack of connection starts catching up with you. That's why Levi and Draza's relationship feels so important to the larger story. The romance isn't just there because every movie needs one. It's directly tied to one of the film's core ideas. Human beings need other people. Simple as that. For all the elaborate world-building and science fiction concepts, one of the movie's biggest observations is also one of its simplest. People aren't meant to spend their lives alone. That theme kept surfacing in different ways throughout the film, not just through romance, through trust, through communication, through the willingness to reach across barriers that aren't supposed to be crossed. The physical gorge separating the characters almost starts feeling symbolic after a while. It's obviously a real location within the story, but it's also representing distance. Emotional distance, personal distance, the walls people build around themselves after enough disappointment or loss. And the movie spends a lot of time watching those walls slowly come down. At the same time, there's another idea running underneath everything that feels a lot darker. Secrecy. The entire world of The Gorge is built on secrecy. People withholding information, organizations hiding the truth, powerful groups deciding what others are allowed to know. The deeper the story goes, the more obvious it becomes that the real danger isn't just whatever exists inside the gorge. It's the fact that so many people have spent years protecting the secret surrounding it. That's where the movie starts touching on questions of responsibility. Who gets to make decisions for everyone else? How much damage can be justified in the name of security? At what point does protecting humanity become an excuse for controlling it? Now, I don't think the film explores those questions in enormous depth. There were definitely moments where I wanted it to push further. The ideas are often more interesting than the actual conversations surrounding them, but I still appreciated that they were present, because without those layers, the movie risks becoming just another creature feature. Instead, there's at least a sense that the story is trying to connect its horror to human behavior. And honestly, that's where the film becomes most unsettling. Not the monsters, not the attacks, not the things crawling around in the dark. The people, the institutions, the choices that created the situation in the first place. That idea shows up again when the movie starts dealing with experimentation and consequences. Without getting into spoiler territory, there's a recurring sense throughout the film that certain lines were crossed a long time ago. The characters are dealing with the aftermath rather than the original decision. That's a classic science fiction theme. Human beings discovering something they don't fully understand and convincing themselves they can control it. Then, years later, somebody else gets stuck cleaning up the mess. The movie isn't especially subtle about that idea, but it doesn't need to be. Some themes work because they're timeless. This is one of them. What surprised me, though, is how often the Gorge circles back to hope despite all of that. For a film filled with secrets, danger, and fairly bleak implications, it never becomes completely cynical. It doesn't seem interested in arguing that people are doomed, or that institutions always win, or that connection is impossible. If anything, it argues the opposite. That trust still matters, that relationships matter, that reaching out to another person can sometimes be the thing that breaks a cycle that's been repeating for years. Maybe that's why the romance remains so central to the movie. It's not just an emotional subplot, it's the film's answer to its own questions. The story spends 2 hours showing us isolation, secrecy, fear, and the consequences of people hiding from one another. Then, it keeps returning to the same solution: connection. Not a complicated answer, not a particularly revolutionary one, but sometimes the simplest ideas are the ones that resonate the longest. And for all of the gorges, monsters, and mysteries, I think that's ultimately what the movie is most interested in exploring. The distance between people, and what happens when somebody finally decides to cross it. If there's one area where the Gorgish is probably going to divide audiences more than anything else, it might be the pacing. Not the creatures, not the romance, not even the mystery, the pacing. Because this is one of those movies where your experience depends heavily on what you're expecting it to be. I've already mentioned that the film spends a surprisingly long time setting things up. But the more I thought about it afterward, the more I realized that the pacing isn't just slow in the traditional sense, it's selective. The movie chooses to spend time on things that many modern genre films would rush through. It lingers, sometimes deliberately. Sometimes maybe a little too deliberately. The opening stretch is a good example. For a while, the story is content to simply exist inside its own premise. Levi arrives. Routines are established. The mystery starts taking shape. The relationship begins to develop. Days pass. Then, more days pass. The film isn't racing toward its major reveals. It's taking the scenic route. And honestly, I kind of admired that, at least initially. There's something refreshing about a movie that isn't immediately trying to bombard the audience with plot developments every 5 minutes. It trusts that the location, the atmosphere, and the growing connection between the characters are enough to keep you invested. For me, they mostly were. But I can also understand why some viewers started checking the runtime, because there are definitely moments where the movie feels comfortable repeating an emotional beat one more time than necessary, or lingering on an idea after we've already understood the point. Not constantly, just enough that you notice it. That's why reactions to the first half seem so split. Some people see it as patient world-building, others see it as slow, and honestly, both interpretations are valid. The movie is asking for a level of patience that not every audience member is going to give it. What's interesting is that once the larger mysteries start opening up, the pacing changes dramatically, almost abruptly. The film goes from a measured slow burn to something much more aggressive. Suddenly, there are answers, new threats, action sequences, escalating stakes. The story starts moving at a completely different speed. In some ways, it almost feels like two separate rhythms stitched together. The first half is about anticipation. The second half is about momentum. That shift worked for me more often than it didn't, but I can see why it became another point of disagreement among reviewers. Some viewers preferred the slower sections. Others were waiting for the movie to finally speed up. What's funny is that both groups probably got what they wanted at different points in the runtime. The challenge is whether those two approaches blend together smoothly enough, and I don't think the answer is always yes. There were moments where I found myself missing the mystery-heavy atmosphere of the opening. The film becomes more interested in solving problems than creating questions, and that naturally changes the energy. At the same time, if the movie had maintained its original pace for 2 full hours, people probably would have complained that nothing happened. That's the balancing act. The story needs to evolve. It needs escalation. It needs payoff. The trick is finding the exact moment to make that transition. I'm not entirely convinced the Gorge nails that timing perfectly. There are stretches where the narrative feels slightly caught between wanting to preserve its mystery and wanting to become a larger action film. You can feel the gears shifting underneath the story. Still, I never found myself completely disengaged, and that's important. There's a difference between a movie being slow and a movie being boring. Those aren't the same thing. I've watched plenty of fast-paced films that felt exhausting because I didn't care about anything happening. I've also watched slow films that held my attention because the atmosphere and characters kept pulling me forward. The Gorgeous falls closer to the second category. Even when the pacing stumbles, there's usually enough curiosity keeping things alive. You want to know what's inside the gorge. You want to know where the relationship is heading. You want answers. Curiosity can cover a lot of structural imperfections. What I do think is worth mentioning is the runtime. There were moments where I wondered if the movie might have benefited from being slightly tighter, not drastically shorter, just a little leaner. A few scenes trimmed here, a few repetitive beats condensed there. Nothing major, just enough to sharpen the momentum without losing the atmosphere that makes the opening sections effective. Because one thing I don't want is a version of this movie that rushes through everything. The slower moments are part of its identity. The problem isn't that they exist. The problem is that occasionally they don't build on one another as efficiently as they could. But overall, I think the structure mostly works because it mirrors the experience of the characters. Life in the towers feels repetitive. Then suddenly, everything changes. The calm disappears. The routine breaks. The world becomes much larger and much more dangerous than it seemed. The pacing follows that same trajectory. Whether you find that satisfying or frustrating will probably come down to personal preference. For me, it wasn't perfect. There were stretches that dragged, there were transitions that felt slightly uneven, but there was also enough mystery, atmosphere, and momentum spread throughout the runtime that I stayed engaged. And honestly, that's often the difference between a movie that's merely slow and a movie that's actually worth taking your time with. Now, this is probably the point where some viewers are going to start arguing with the movie. Not emotionally, logistically. Because the deeper the gorge gets into its story, the more questions it invites, and I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. The relationship is what carries it across the finish line. That's an important distinction. Because even when I found myself questioning certain explanations or wishing particular ideas had been explored further, I was still invested in what happened to these characters. The emotional resolution ended up carrying more weight than the logistical resolution. And honestly, I think that's exactly what the filmmakers intended. The movie has been telling us that from the beginning. For all its monsters and conspiracies, the Gorge has always been more interested in human connection than mythology. The ending simply doubles down on that idea. Of course, that approach won't work for everyone. I've already talked about the horror versus romance debate, and the finale becomes another extension of that conversation. Some viewers are probably going to wish the movie finished on a darker note. Others may want more time spent exploring the larger implications of everything that's been revealed. Some may feel the ending plays things a little safer than the premise initially suggested. I can understand those reactions. There were moments where I wondered what a slightly bolder version of the ending might have looked like. Not necessarily a darker ending, just one that pushed a little further into the stranger possibilities the film occasionally hints at. Because one thing The Gorgeous does exceptionally well is create curiosity. Even after many of the answers arrive, there are still corners of this world that feel unexplored, still stories that feel untold, still questions lingering around the edges. Part of me wanted to spend more time there. At the same time, I don't think every mystery needs to be exhausted. Sometimes leaving a little space around the edges helps preserve the atmosphere that made the concept interesting in the first place. And honestly, by the time the credits rolled, I found myself feeling more satisfied than frustrated, not blown away, not convinced I'd just watched a masterpiece, but satisfied, which is actually harder to achieve than people realize. A satisfying ending isn't necessarily one that surprises you. It isn't necessarily one that shocks you. Sometimes it's simply an ending that feels earned, an ending that understands what story it's been telling. And despite all the genre hopping, all the tonal shifts, all the mysteries and monsters and action sequences, I think The Gorge ultimately knows what story it wants to be. Whether you agree with that choice is another conversation. But the movie commits to it, and because of that, the finale feels less like a collection of plot resolutions and more like the natural conclusion of the emotional journey that started all the way back in those lonely towers. By the end, I wasn't thinking about every unanswered question. I wasn't thinking about every logical inconsistency. I wasn't even thinking about the creatures. I was thinking about the two people at the center of it all, and honestly, that's probably the strongest indication that the ending did its job. One of the more interesting things about the Gorge is that it's almost impossible to watch without being reminded of other movies. Not because it's copying them, not because it's ripping ideas directly from somewhere else, just because the film wears its inspirations pretty openly. And honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing. Most genre movies are conversations with older genre movies anyway. The question isn't whether influences exist. The question is whether a film can take those influences and build something that feels like its own thing. Watching The Gorge, there were moments where different parts of the movie triggered completely different memories. Sometimes it was the creature horror, sometimes it was the atmosphere, sometimes it was the mystery. Sometimes it was the strange mixture of genres that shouldn't fit together but somehow keep coexisting anyway. The horror side of the film, especially early on, reminded me of those stories where fear comes from, uncertainty more than direct confrontation. You know that feeling when a movie introduces a location, and the location itself feels dangerous before you've even seen the threat? The Gorge taps into that really effectively. There are stretches where the environment is doing as much work as the creatures, the fog, the isolation, the sense that something is lurking just outside your field of vision. Those moments gave me flashes of a lot of different science fiction and horror stories that use atmosphere as their primary weapon. Then the movie starts expanding. The mythology gets bigger. The conspiracy gets bigger. The world becomes larger than the immediate situation. And suddenly, you're in a completely different kind of genre territory. What's funny is that the film never settles into a single influence for very long. Just when it starts feeling like a creature feature, it pivots into romance. Just when it feels like romance, it becomes a mystery. Then it drifts into action. Then science fiction. Then back again. It's constantly reshuffling its own identity. That's probably why different viewers end up making completely different comparisons. Everyone latches on to the part that stood out most to them. For some people, the monsters are the headline. For others, it's the relationship. For others, it's the secret operation and the larger mythology. None of those readings are wrong. The movie genuinely contains all of those things. I also think the film benefits from not feeling trapped by any one influence. There were multiple points where I thought I knew exactly where a particular storyline was heading because I'd seen similar setups before. Then the movie would take a turn and remind me that it wasn't interested in becoming a straightforward version of whatever comparison I had in my head. Not every surprise worked perfectly, but I appreciated the effort. Because one of the easiest traps for a genre movie is becoming a collection of references. A scene that reminds you of another movie, then another scene, then another, until eventually the film stops feeling like its own creation. I never really had that problem here. The influences are visible, sure, sometimes very visible, but they usually feel filtered through the movie's own personality. The romance is probably the biggest example of that. A lot of films with this premise would have pushed much harder toward horror or action. The Gorge repeatedly chooses emotional connection instead. Whether you love that choice or hate it, it's one of the main reasons the movie stands apart from many of the stories it superficially resembles. It gives the film its own rhythm, its own priorities, its own identity, and honestly, that's what matters most. Because at a certain point, every movie starts resembling something else. Every science fiction story reminds you of another science fiction story. Every horror movie carries traces of what came before it. The real test is whether you remember the movie itself after it's over, not the references, not the comparisons, the movie. For me, The Gorge passes that test. When I think back on it now, I'm not primarily thinking about the influences. I'm not mentally sorting through all the films that share similar DNA. I'm thinking about the image of those towers, the strange atmosphere surrounding the gorge, the relationship at the center of the story, the mixture of romance, horror, mystery, and action that somehow managed to coexist in the same film. That's usually a good sign, because the strongest influences are the ones you notice while you're watching. The strongest identity is what stays with you afterward, and whatever its flaws may be, The Gorge ultimately has enough of its own personality that it doesn't feel trapped in anyone else's shadow. So where does all of that leave The Gorge? Honestly, it's one of the more difficult movies I've reviewed in a while, not because I don't know how I feel about it, because I feel several different things about it at the same time. There are movies that make your job easy. You watch them, and within 10 minutes of the credits rolling, you already know exactly where they belong in your mind. Great, bad, forgettable, disappointing. Whatever the case may be. The Gorge never quite settled into a simple category for me. The longer I sat with it, the more I found myself appreciating certain things while still recognizing some very obvious flaws. And weirdly enough, that might be one of the reasons it stayed in my head. Because this is not a movie that plays everything safe. You can criticize the pacing, you can criticize some of the logic, you can question certain story decisions. You can absolutely argue that some ideas are more interesting than the film's execution of those ideas. I think all of those criticisms are fair. There were multiple points where I found myself wishing the screenplay pushed further into certain concepts. Times where I wanted more exploration of the mythology. Moments where I thought the horror elements could have been darker, stranger, or more unsettling. And yet, I never stopped wanting to see where the story was going. That's important. A movie can be imperfect and still be compelling. In some ways, those are often the films people remember longer. What keeps coming back to me isn't a specific action sequence or a particular reveal. It's the concept, the image. Two isolated people standing watch over a mystery neither of them fully understands. There's something undeniably strong about that setup. The movie gets a lot of mileage out of it. More than I initially expected, honestly. And I think that's largely because the film commits to its own weirdness. It doesn't constantly apologize for itself. It doesn't spend the entire runtime trying to convince you how clever it is. It just takes a bizarre idea and follows it wherever that idea leads. Sometimes that leads somewhere fascinating. Sometimes it leads somewhere messy. Most of the time it leads somewhere interesting. I also think the film benefits from arriving with relatively few expectations attached to it. This wasn't a movie surrounded by years of hype. It wasn't carrying the burden of a massive franchise. It wasn't trying to set up 15 sequels before finishing its own story. It simply wanted to tell a strange genre tale with romance, mystery, horror, action, and science fiction, all sharing the same space. That's a surprisingly rare thing these days. A lot of modern movies feel designed by committee. Every edge sanded down, every risk calculated, every decision optimized. The Gorge occasionally feels like the opposite, not reckless, just willing to take chances. And even when those chances don't completely work, I found myself respecting the attempt. Because at least the movie has an identity. At least it has personality. You may not agree with every creative choice, but you can feel those choices being made. You can feel the film trying to be something specific. That's becoming increasingly valuable. Now, do I think The Gorge reaches the full potential of its premise? Probably not. The premise is so good that almost any finished version of the movie was going to struggle to live up to the possibilities people imagined in their heads. That's the curse of a great setup. The audience starts creating their own version before the movie even reveals its own. Still, I think the film gets closer than some people will give it credit for. The relationship works more often than it doesn't. The atmosphere is consistently strong. The mystery keeps pulling you forward. The performances anchor the stranger elements. The visuals create a memorable world. Even the aspects that don't entirely land are usually attached to ideas that are worth exploring. And honestly, I'd rather watch a movie fail while reaching for something ambitious than succeed while playing it completely safe. Maybe that's the best way to sum up. The Gorge. It's ambitious. Sometimes more ambitious than polished. Sometimes more ambitious than disciplined. But ambitious nonetheless. By the end, I wasn't thinking about whether every plot point made perfect sense. I wasn't thinking about whether every genre element received equal attention. I wasn't mentally tallying flaws and strengths like a scorecard. I was thinking about the experience, about the atmosphere, about the mystery, about the strange combination of romance and horror that somehow managed to coexist for 2 hours without completely collapsing. And maybe that's the film's biggest achievement. Not that it works perfectly, that it works at all. Because when you describe The Gorge out loud, it sounds like a movie that shouldn't exist. A lonely love story, a monster movie, a conspiracy thriller, a science fiction mystery, an action-adventure. All happening inside the same story. Somehow, against the odds, it finds a way to hold those pieces together. Not flawlessly, but convincingly enough that I stayed invested from beginning to end. And in a streaming landscape full of movies that disappear from memory almost immediately, that alone makes The Gorge worth paying attention to. You may love it, You may be frustrated by it. You may find yourself somewhere in between. But I doubt you'll confuse it with anything else. And sometimes, that's a victory all by itself.